Berlin, April 22, 1945, just before noon. A small German army aircraft lands on a section of Charlottenburger Chaussee that has been cleared of debris 4 hours earlier. A man in a dark gray civilian suit steps out. His name is Albert Speer. He is the Minister of Armaments of the Third Reich. He is flown from Hamburg through Soviet anti-aircraft fire to reach this street. He is walking into Adolf Hitler's bunker to tell Hitler, to his face, that he has spent the previous 30 days secretly sabotaging Hitler's final order. The order, issued 1 month earlier, would have killed, by Speer's own later estimate, between 5 and 10 million German civilians by starvation in the 18 months after the war. Speer chose not to carry it out. Soviet forward units are 800 meters from the bunker entrance. In the previous week, Hitler has ordered the execution of 2 of his oldest associates for less. Speer is about to confess treason, in person, to a dictator with nothing left to lose. 2 questions decide what happens next. How does the Minister of Armaments of Nazi Germany, a man who knew exactly what was happening in the camps, talk his way out of being shot by Hitler at the end of his life? And how does he, in the 4 decades that follow, build himself a posthumous reputation as a good Nazi that will not be definitively destroyed until a single letter is found in a Stockholm archive in 2007? To understand who Albert Speer was when he landed on the Charlottenburger Chaussee in April 1945, you have to go back 15 years. Mannheim, Germany, March 19, 1905. Albert Speer is born to Hermann Speer, a wealthy architect, and Louise Hummel, the daughter of a Mannheim industrialist. The family is upper middle class, politically conservative, and not, in 1905, anti-Semitic in any documented way. Speer studied architecture at the Technical University of Berlin, graduating in 1927. In December 1930, he attended a National Socialist rally in Berlin. He heard Adolf Hitler speak for the first time. He joined the Nazi Party on March 1, 1931. He was 25 years old. He was not, by any of his subsequent statements, an anti-Semite. He joined, by his own 1969 memoir, because Hitler had given a speech about restoring Germany's national dignity that had moved him. That is what he said. The historian Magnus Bredtken, in his 2017 biography, would establish that Speer's correspondence from 1931 to 1933 already contained the standard Nazi vocabulary about Jewish influence in German cultural life. His first commission for the Nazi Party came in May 1933, the staging of the Tempelhof field rally. Hitler attended. Hitler liked what he saw. By August 1934, Albert Speer was the official Nazi Party architect. By 1939, he had designed the new Reich Chancellery, the building beneath whose garden, 6 years later, Adolf Hitler would shoot himself. On February 8, 1942, the Minister of Armaments, Fritz Todt, died in a plane crash. Hitler appointed Speer to replace him on the same afternoon. Speer was 36 years old. Over the next 3 years, his ministry would expand from a staff of 2,000 to a workforce of approximately 14 million people. Approximately 5 million of those 14 million were forced laborers brought to Germany from occupied territories. Approximately 1.5 million were inmates of concentration camps, transferred to munitions factories under the SS labor rental program. The man who would, on April 22, 1945, fly through Soviet anti-aircraft fire to confess treason to Adolf Hitler was the same man whose signature appeared on the labor requisition orders for the Auschwitz-Buna factory. Both things were true at the same time. This is not a story with a hero. By the second week of March 1945, the war was over, and Albert Speer knew it. The Red Army was on the Oder River, 80 kilometers from Berlin. American forces had crossed the Rhine at Remagen on March 7th. The German army had, in 3 months, lost the entire industrial belt between Aachen and Frankfurt. German oil production was at 3% of its 1940 peak. Speer wrote a memorandum. It was 22 pages long. He delivered it personally to Hitler at the Reich Chancellery on the afternoon of March 18, 1945. The memorandum was, by the standards of Nazi internal communications, extraordinary. It stated explicitly that the German war effort would collapse within 4 to 8 weeks. It stated that the only remaining duty of the German state was to preserve enough infrastructure to keep the civilian population alive after the inevitable defeat. It listed, in 3 columns, what needed to be protected: water systems, electrical grids, food storage, rail bridges, coal mines, the basic machinery of survival. Hitler read the memorandum. He set it down on the desk. He did not raise his voice. Speer's account of Hitler's response, preserved in the 1946 Nuremberg testimony of Speer's secretary, Anne-Marie Kempf, who had heard him repeat the conversation that evening, has been corroborated by 2 other witnesses. Hitler said, "If the war is lost, the nation will also perish. There is no need to consider the basis of even a most primitive existence for the German people. On the contrary, it is better to destroy these things ourselves. The nation has proved itself the weaker. The future belongs solely to the stronger Eastern nation. What remains after this war will, in any case, be inferior, because the best have fallen." The next day, March 19, 1945, Hitler signed a decree. It was officially titled Befehl betreffend Zerstörungsmaßnahmen im Reichsgebiet, Decree concerning demolitions on Reich territory. It became known to history as the Nero Decree. It ordered the destruction, before any Allied advance, of every industrial facility, every railway, every bridge, every water main, every power station, every food warehouse on German soil. It was signed on Albert Speer's 40th birthday. What Albert Speer decided to do in the 11 days between the Nero Decree's signing on March 19th and his next meeting with Hitler on March 30th has been reconstructed from his post-war testimony, his surviving ministerial directives, and the diary of Joseph Goebbels. He decided he would not carry out the order. He decided he would not refuse it openly. He would, instead, lie. Exclusive authority to coordinate the implementation of the decree. His argument in the Reich Chancellery's study was technical.
Mein Führer, if we detonate the factories now, we deprive our own forces of the weapons they need for the final defensive battle. Allow me to determine the moment of demolition for each facility.
Hitler agreed. He signed the supplementary order within the week. Speer was now, on paper, the sole official responsible for executing the destruction of every industrial facility in Germany. He used the authority to do the opposite. He sent telegrams, over his ministerial signature in his personal cipher, to the directors of every major industrial plant in the Reich. The telegrams instructed them not to detonate their facilities. They were to temporarily disable the machinery by hiding critical components, draining oil from engines, removing electrical cables. On paper, the directors could report that the factories had been rendered useless to the enemy. In practice, every disabled factory could be restored to production within 72 hours of liberation. On March 31st, Speer convened a meeting at Krupp's Essen headquarters with the senior executives of the 4 largest German industrial combines: Krupp, Thyssen, Siemens, and E.G. Farben. The meeting was held without the knowledge of any party representative. Speer told them what he was doing. He asked for their cooperation. By the end of the meeting, all 4 companies had agreed. The next move was to block the explosives. Speer's ministry controlled the wartime distribution of industrial demolition charges. Beginning the first week of April, he issued internal orders reducing the allocation of explosives to Gauleiter-controlled demolition units by approximately 90%. The justification, submitted in writing, was that explosives were needed for the front. The fascist regional commanders charged with implementing the Nero Decree by mid-April 1945 had nothing to detonate with. In late March 1945, Joseph Goebbels recorded in his personal diary that Speer had become soft and was not implementing the destruction demanded by the Führer. Goebbels did not yet have the evidence to act on it. The hardest part of the operation was the army. The Wehrmacht, by April 1945, a fragmented force of approximately 2 million troops, was nominally still under the command of the Reich Chancellery. Several of its generals were ideological fascists who would carry out the Nero Decree without hesitation. Speer decided to visit them personally. Between April 3rd and April 21st, Albert Speer drove approximately 1,400 kilometers across what remained of unoccupied Germany. He went to the headquarters of every army group commander whose forces still controlled industrial regions. He went to Heinrichi on the Vistula front. He went to Schultz at the Saar. He went to Kesselring in Bavaria. His pitch, by the post-war testimony of 3 of the generals he visited, was the same.
If you destroy the bridges, you will destroy your own supply lines. If you flood the mines, your own families will starve. The war is lost. The question is whether Germany will have a country left when it is over.
Most of the generals, by then exhausted, sick of Nazi Party officials, and increasingly aware that their families were the same civilians the Nero Decree would kill, agreed. The most consequential agreement came from Field Marshal Walter Model. Model commanded Army Group B, holding the Ruhr Industrial Basin, the single largest concentration of German industry, containing approximately 1,250 functional factories and the steelworks of Krupp. Speer met Model on April 3rd at his headquarters near Dortmund. Their conversation lasted 9 hours. Model refused, formally, to disobey the decree. But when Speer left, Model did not issue the demolition orders to his subordinate commanders. On April 18th, Model formally dissolved Army Group B. 325,000 German soldiers surrendered to the U.S. Ninth Army, the largest single capitulation in German military history. The Ruhr factories were intact. On April 21st, Walter Model walked into a wooded area near Lintorf between Dusseldorf and Duisburg and shot himself. His adjutant found him the same day. In conversations with his staff during the previous week, Model had repeatedly stated that he was not a traitor and that he had done what was possible for Germany, but that he had not done what had been demanded of him. A field marshal, in his own words, did not surrender. By April 22nd, when Albert Speer climbed into a small German army aircraft and flew toward Berlin, approximately 95% of German industrial infrastructure was still standing. It would still be standing on May 8th. The Feisler Storch, a single-engine reconnaissance aircraft with a top speed of 175 kilometers per hour, left Hamburg at 10 in the morning on April 22, 1945. It flew low, below Soviet radar, across 120 kilometers of contested airspace. It landed on Charlottenburger Chaussee at 11:45. Albert Speer was met by an SS officer in an open staff car. He was driven the 3 kilometers to the Reich Chancellery. He entered the bunker through the garden entrance at 12:20. He waited in the upper-level conference room for approximately 6 hours. Hitler received him at 2300 hours. The conversation that followed in the small private apartment at the end of the lower bunker corridor has been described in 3 places: Speer's own 1969 memoir, the post-war testimony of Hitler's secretary, Traudl Jung, and a single conversation Speer had in 1971 with the journalist Gitta Sereni, who recorded it in shorthand. The accounts agree on the structure. They disagree on the specifics. What is documented? The conversation lasted approximately 4 hours, until 3 in the morning on April 23rd. Speer raised the subject of the Nero Decree. He told Hitler that the order had not been fully carried out. He told Hitler that he, personally, had made decisions that had preserved German infrastructure against the order's explicit requirements. Hitler did not raise his voice. He did not order Speer's arrest. He did not, by any of the 3 accounts, ask Speer to provide details of the sabotage. He listened. According to Speer's memoir, Hitler ended the conversation by saying, "If it has happened, It has happened. You are tired. Go. Whether this is what Hitler said or what Speer wished he had said 24 years later, historians still dispute. What is certain is what happened at 3 in the morning on April 23, 1945. Albert Speer walked out of the Führerbunker. He climbed into a waiting staff car. He was driven back to the airfield on Charlottenburger Chaussee. He flew back to Hamburg. He was, by the standards of the regime he had served for 14 years, a man who had walked into the bunker as a confessed traitor and walked out alive. It was, in his own subsequent assessment, the only conversation of his life he would never fully understand. Albert Speer was arrested on May 23, 1945 in Flensburg by British forces who had located the rump German government attempting to operate as the successor to Hitler. He was transported to the IMT detention facility at Nuremberg in October 1945. The International Military Tribunal opened on November 20th. 24 senior Nazi officials were charged. Speer was charged on 4 counts: conspiracy to wage aggressive war, crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The strongest single piece of evidence against him was the documented use of approximately 5 million forced laborers by his ministry, including approximately 1.5 million concentration camp inmates whose conditions his own subordinates testified he was familiar with. Speer's defense strategy, developed with his attorney Hans Flexner, had 3 components. First, he had not been a member of the SS or the security apparatus. He was a technocrat who had administered industrial production. Second, he took responsibility, in his testimony, for the use of forced labor in a way none of the other defendants had. He stated,
"I cannot evade responsibility for what was done in my ministry."
Third, he had, in the final weeks of the war, defied Hitler's Nero Decree and saved German civilians from a death by starvation that would have killed millions. The third claim was, in its broad outline, true. The first claim was technically true, but elided his role in the slave labor system. The second claim, taking responsibility, was a calculated rhetorical move that distinguished him from the other defendants and probably saved his life. The tribunal delivered its verdict on October 1, 1946. Of the 22 defendants brought to verdict, 12 were sentenced to death by hanging. 3 received life imprisonment. 4 received fixed-term sentences. 3 were acquitted. Albert Speer was sentenced to 20 years. His deputy at the Ministry of Armaments, Fritz Sockel, the official responsible for the procurement and transport of the forced laborers, was sentenced to death and hanged on October 16, 1946. Speer was transferred to Spandau Prison in West Berlin in July 1947. He served the next 20 years in a facility built for 700 inmates that, by the late 1950s, held 7. He was one of them. He was released at midnight on October 1, 1966. 20 years, day for day. He was 61 years old. He had spent the entire sentence preparing to be remembered as the wrong kind of Nazi. In 1969, 3 years after his release from Spandau, Albert Speer published Erinnerungen, Memoirs. The English edition appeared the following year under the title Inside the Third Reich. The book sold approximately 5 million copies in 15 languages. It became the most widely read first-person account of the Nazi regime ever published by a senior participant. It told a specific story. Speer, the technocrat, had been seduced by Hitler's charisma into joining a movement whose moral content he had not, at the time, fully understood. Speer, the architect, had risen on talent. Speer, the minister, had administered production without engaging with the security apparatus. Speer, in March 1945, had recognized the catastrophe and, at risk of his own life, saved Germany from total destruction. Speer had not known, by his own account in the book, about the specific operations of the death camps. The book was published to almost universal critical acclaim. The historian Hugh Trevor Roper, in his review for the New York Times, called Speer the only Nazi to have written intelligently about what he had done. For the next 38 years, inside the Third Reich defined the international understanding of Albert Speer. He gave interviews. He appeared on West German television. He corresponded with historians. The persona he had constructed at Nuremberg, the apolitical technocrat who had used his skills to save lives, became the dominant image. He died in London on September 1, 1981, of a cerebral hemorrhage. He had been recording a BBC television interview that morning. He was 76 years old. The story he had constructed survived him. It survived until 2007. In that year, a researcher working in a Swedish archive located a letter Albert Speer had written in the early 1970s to a Belgian Holocaust survivor named Helene Gentil Raven. The letter had never been published. Speer had not realized, when he wrote it, that the recipient would deposit it with the archive on her death. The letter contained a single, complete sentence that destroyed the structure Albert Speer had spent 40 years building. I was present at the speech Himmler gave in Posen on October 6, 1943, where he spoke explicitly about the extermination of the Jews. Speer had, at every previous opportunity in his life, denied attending that speech. He had denied knowing what was happening in the camps. He had lied for 36 years. In 2017, the German historian Magnus Bredtken published a 900-page demolition of every remaining claim in Speer's memoir. The book established, by means of an exhaustive review of internal Nazi documents, that Speer had not been a technocrat. He had been a perpetrator who had known what he was perpetrating. The single thing Bredtken could not deny was that the sabotage of the Nero Decree had happened. A man who knew exactly what was happening in the camps, who facilitated it through his ministry's labor requisitions, who attended Himmler's October 1943 speech, who lived for 40 years lying about both, had also, in the final 30 days of the war, used his authority to save the country in which those camps had operated from physical destruction. Both things were true. Albert Speer is buried in Heidelberg. His grave is unmarked, by request of his family. At Nuremberg in 1946, in the closing statement of his defense, Albert Speer had told the tribunal,
"I cannot understand how I could have been so blind."
He repeated the sentence in interviews for the next 35 years. After 2007, no historian believed him. The factories remained. The lie did not.